The Magic Show of Professor Whimsy. Under a stripy red and gold tent, evening hummed with small lights. A sign rocked gently, Professor Whimsy, Magic and Wonder. Professor Whimsy tiptoed in, hat tall, coat bright, shoes that made a soft click. He breathed in the warm tent smell of straw and honey and set his shiny wand on a little table. Outside, tiny feet and soft paws gathered. The tent flap opened like a friendly mouth, inviting everyone to come close and watch the gentle show begin. First came Lila with braids and bright dress, eyes like two big moons. She giggled and clasped her hands. Then Buttons the rabbit hopped in, floppy ears bouncing, nose wiggling, bow tie a splash of stripes. Mr. Bumble patted slowly, like a little drum, honey on his nose from a tiny snack. Children and grown-ups settled onto cushions. A hush that was more happy than quiet fell over the tent, the kind of hush where every little sound feels like a secret. Professor Whimsy bowed with a grand little flourish. He tapped his shining wand on the table and tiny pinches of light jumped up, tittle-tittle. The lights turned into sleepy stars that danced above the crowd. Sparkle the balloon floated forward, twinkling dots along its shiny blue skin. Everyone clapped very softly, like pats on a pillow. The professor whispered a little rhyme, and the stars shuffled, as if they were listening and very pleased to be part of the show. For the first trick, the professor tapped his hat with the glowing wand. From the hat popped a ribbon, then another, then a whole rainbow of scarves, each soft as a cloud. Lila laughed and wrapped one scarf gently around her shoulders. Buttons hopped around the scarves like a tiny king. The scarves made soft swoosh-swoosh sounds as they flew. Little hands reached for color, and the tent smelled faintly of sugar and giggles, as if magic could be smelled and tasted. Then the professor said, very softly, that the hat liked to play hide-and-seek. He asked for a helper. Buttons the rabbit wiggled his nose and hopped right into the hat, ears flopping. The hat made a tiny sigh and grew warm and snug. The children leaned in, breaths held like tiny little birds. The hat looked plain on the outside, but inside, perhaps, there was a very small, very warm world where hops and soft paws could hide for a moment. Professor Whimsy waved his wand in a sweet, slow way. Out of the hat came not only buttons, but a cascade of tiny paper moons, each one twinkling. The moons sailed like little boats, and the friendly moon at the tent flap winked back. Mr. Bumble hummed a tiny tune that sounded like a rocking boat. Everyone laughed softly as the moons landed on shoulders and heads, and Buttons shook himself and gave his bow tie a proud little toss. The professor whispered that now was a quiet trick, a trick for listening. He tapped the wand on the floor, and the tent lights answered with tiny bells. Sparkle the balloon hummed like a tiny bell too, its ribbons singing a little melody. Lila closed her eyes and smiled, listening to the lights and the balloon and the gentle hum of the tent. Even the straw seemed to hush, and the stars above made a soft, sleepy rhythm. Then Professor Whimsy stood very tall and said, with a smile as wide as a moon, that a big surprise would come. He placed the magic top hat on a stool and tapped it 3 times. A hush bigger than the first hush spread through the tent. Even the friendly moon leaned closer. Buttons hopped on a cushion and wiggled his nose. Hearts beat quick but soft. The professor lifted his wand and asked everyone to clap, a gentle drum for the big moment. Now for a trick that made bellies tipple with wonder, the vanish-and-return. The professor said the words softly, and the hat shimmered as if it were breathing. With a puff that smelled of honey and peppermint, the hat seemed to swallow a tiny sound. Buttons gave one last excited hop, then the hat looked empty. The crowd blinked and leaned forward. Was Buttons gone? A tiny hush turned to a whisper that sounded like a question floating up to the stars. Suddenly, the hat popped. Out flew a flurry of confetti moons and tiny sparkles like bouncing peas. A bright little parade of stars tumbled out, giggling in their own little way. Sparkle the balloon drifted through the parade, chuckling softly. Then, with a triumphant drum roll that Mr. Bumble hummed right on cue, Buttons popped out perched on Sparkle's ribbon, waving one tiny paw. The tent exploded into a happy, soft cheer that sounded like clapping clouds. Children laughed until cheeks were round and eyes shone. Lila jumped up and gave Buttons a soft hug. Professor Whimsy took a grand bow and tipped his hat until a shy feather floated out and landed on his shoulder. Everyone clapped and clapped, some on laps, some on tiny palms. Mr. Bumble offered honey cakes from a basket, sweet and small, and the tent smelled like sticky smiles. The night felt like a warm blanket wrapped in giggles. As the show slowed, the friendly moon edged the tent flap open wider and sprinkled tiny stardust down like soft sugar. The professor waved his wand gently, and the stars folded themselves into pockets of light to take home in memories. Sparkle the balloon drifted up and brushed the roof as if tucking the tent in. Little yawns began to bloom like tiny flowers. The professor whispered thank you and good night, a ribbon of words soft as a lullaby. Outside, families wandered home under the smiling moon, carrying pockets of stardust and warm giggles. Lila hugged her scarf and found her shoes, Buttons tucked into a cozy basket with his striped bow tie neat, and Mr. Bumble hummed a honey lullaby to himself. Professor Whimsy folded his tent with careful hands and watched as every little light blinked goodnight. He waved a small hand and filled a jar with the last brave star for himself. That night, Lila curled into bed with a scarf around her shoulders and a tiny paper moon on her pillow. She thought of stars that danced and a hat that could hold surprises. Buttons dreamed of soft hats and ribbon bridges. Mr. Bumble dreamed of honey trees. Even the friendly moon hummed a sleepy tune. If you listened very closely, you could hear the tent whisper that magic lives in small, kind things and in the warm hands that share them. Professor Whimsy walked home under the moon, hat tucked under one arm and wand glowing like a little friendly firefly. He hummed a soft tune and thought of next night's show, of new scarves and quieter tricks. He folded a small star into his pocket for a rainy day and winked at the friendly moon. The world felt very big and also very small, and the professor smiled because in that hug between, magic felt easy and very true. Some nights, if you pass the stripy tent and press your ear to the soft wall, you can still hear a little rattle of scarves and the faint hum of a lullaby. Magic, the professor says, is a pocket of warm light that lives where friends laugh and hands are kind. The tent sleeps, the moon watches, and a balloon drifts in dreams. The end of one wonderful show is simply the beginning of the next small, shining surprise.